Welcome to the Phoenix Effect Podcast with Elle, Kristen, and Dennis. We are three narrative-trained therapists, and we will be interviewing storytellers from all walks of life. We will explore what people do to find belonging, purpose, and success. Listen in as we delve into the depths of the human experience. If you have a story you would like to tell, stay tuned to find out how to become a part of the show. Are you ready for a good story? Here we go. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you tell our listeners where you are in the world and what you like to do while you're there?
Sure. I live in Tucson, Arizona, and I've been here, since like 2006. So quite a bit, even though I didn't grow up here. And I'm a breathwork facilitator and integrative specialist. As far as what I like to do when it's not super hot, I like to get outside and enjoy the beauty of Tucson, do a lot of hiking, music, meditation, and, things around my work.
And so you do a lot of outdoor things, a lot of breath work. It sounds
Yeah.
like being in your body is really important to you. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. Breathwork is a big part of my life. Being in my body is a big part of my life. I'm also a somatic experiencing practitioner, finishing up my second year of training with that. But I've also been doing somatic experiencing as a client for about 5 years as a way of integrating some psychedelic work and just healing and self-discovery. So yeah, being in my body is a big sort of focus. And sometimes I'm sharing with people that I work with, like how there's times where even I'll pause and just be like, hey, can we just pause and just give me a moment to take this in and receive that? And that's something a few years ago I would have had no clue or awareness around.
I love that. I hope we get to do it during the podcast. I think it would be really fun if we kind of took a moment and checked in with our bodies. A lot of our guests
Mm.
don't have quite the background that you do, so that might be an interesting way to engage with you if you're okay with that.
Yeah, 100%.
How was it for you to write your story, Jonathan?
It was initially challenging just to find what I felt like was the right story. I really obsessed over it a little bit about what is the right story and what's the angle, and especially with the focus in mind of what do I want your audience to sort of take away from the story. And then it came to me not really with effort. I was actually leading a breathwork session yesterday for kind of my main core group. And for some reason, I decided to share this story. And as I was sharing it, I realized, man, I tell this story almost every time I do a new meditation class. Even if I don't tell it, I'm thinking about it as I'm like going to the group as a way to sort of prime myself. And especially because a lot of these classes that I'm doing are taking place in a residential treatment center where people are brand new to meditation. A lot of them have a lot of internal blocks about being able to meditate. And so to be able to share this story where in a way, I'm saying like, hey, in the beginning of this story, like I was just like you. I was in this place where I didn't know what was going on. My life was kind of out of control. And this is one of the things, meditation, that helped me change it. I find that very grounding, and also like it gives me a moment to drop into gratitude and sort of see the bigger picture of the journey that I've been on so far in my life.
Wonderful. When you are ready, read it to us.
Okay. So this story occurred on February 1st, 2004. I had just started meditating and learning about Buddhism, and I was really getting into it, probably a little bit obsessively. I didn't have a lot of skill, realization, or a deep understanding of what I was doing, but I was putting in the reps. I was really doing the practice. There were still many things I hadn't realized yet about myself, like the dissatisfaction I felt with my job and my lifestyle. I was still drinking almost every day, and my daily routine wasn't what I would call spiritual. One of the first things I learned when I started meditating was not to trust something just because somebody else said it, even if that someone else was the Buddha or some other so-called guru. I was determined to have my own direct experiences and use those to discern what was real for me. On this particular day, which was Super Bowl Sunday, in fact, I was living in LA and I decided that I would go to the beach to meditate. In my mind, there was this romanticized fantasy that I'd be sitting on the sand, staring at the ocean, having these deep meditative insights, like this real Zen moment where I would really be like a real meditator. And I had driven to the beach. If you live in LA or if you've been in LA, the beach is a close for most people. It's quite a drive. I drove to the beach, and when I got there, it was almost deserted. It was February. It was cold, and not only was it cold, it was excessively windy. The reality of my situation, opening the car door, didn't match the idealized version of this peaceful meditation on the beach that I had set out to do. I remember getting out of my car and realizing that it wasn't a great idea. I even considered going back home, but there was something stubborn in me that said, no, you're here. This is the commitment that you made. Follow through with that. And so I walked down to the shore and I sat down. I started to meditate. And to be honest, I was miserable. The wind was blowing sand in my face. It was really cold. The whole meditation was basically me being painfully aware of how uncomfortable I was and how much I did not want to be there. But then towards the end of the meditation, something shifted. It's hard to describe because it wasn't a thought or something that even is easy to express in words. It was a direct feeling. Suddenly, I became vividly aware of how tired I was, and not just tired of sitting in the cold and the wind, but tired of how I was living my life. I was exhausted from the cycle I had trapped myself in, getting high every day before work, at work, after work, and then getting loaded until I passed out only to wake up and do it all over again. It wasn't a thought even, it was a profound realization. I felt the weight of that exhaustion deeply. And it was in that moment that I decided I wanted to change. And that day marked the beginning of my sobriety, where I stayed sober for 7 years after that. That experience deepened my meditation practice and strengthened my commitment to Buddhism. It set off a chain reaction in my life. I ended up leaving my job. I moved away from LA, and eventually I found myself in Tibet, where I lived for a year. When I was there, I met my now ex-wife, and all of this led me to the path that I'm on today, the work that I do, which is much more aligned to my purpose with helping others, exploring the depths of not only myself, but helping them explore theirs and diving into deep parts of my psyche. If I had given up and gone home that day, I don't think I would have had that experience. I had to put in the reps. I had to integrate that moment into my life. And I remember even after having this big realization, this moment of clarity, I remember going home and driving home, getting back to my house, and my roommate was there with a bunch of people watching the Super Bowl. There were a lot of chances to slip back into those old habits. But I listened to that inner voice and that clarity that I had found amidst the discomfort. And when I look back, it all ties into things that I learned later on, both in meditation and in recovery. In meditation, it's taught that clarity leads to insight and that the two are so closely related together. In the 12-step program, there's this idea of having a moment of clarity, this brief window where you can clearly see the direction that you need to take. That cold, uncomfortable day at the beach was my moment of clarity, buried in a sea of discomfort and discontent. It was a turning point that changed everything for me.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah.
How was it for you to read your story?
It takes me back. Like there's certain moments within that memory that are so clear and so vivid. And yeah, I really do, when I think about it, it starts to help me to see like what came after that. All the things that experience that I didn't know at the time was going to lead to. At the time, it was fairly profound as far as experiences go, but I didn't know that it was going to lead me through all these other steps and to the place that I am now. Oftentimes have these moments where I kind of pause and I go, wow, like if I passed myself on the street 5 years ago, I don't think I would recognize myself. And everything that I'm doing now, in a way, is due to that experience, that first experience. Like, that was the first time I really experienced something that was sort of unexplainable, that I couldn't really put into words, but I had experienced. And so I knew that it was true. It wouldn't be the last time, thankfully. But yeah, I had no idea where all of that was going to lead. And I can see that now. And that's kind of what comes up for me as I share it.
Yeah, were there certain points that you were drawn to in this remembering of that story that you just feel really connected?
I think in a way, like right now, I'm connecting to just that version of myself that was so lost and like searching for some sort of something better, something different. And just, I, again, hindsight being 2020, you can sort of go, oh my gosh, but at the time, yeah, I remember like my roommate was a big DJ in LA and he was teaching me to DJ. And I was getting to the point where I was almost at the point of quitting my day job and being able to DJ professionally. And then all this meditation just sort of took me right out of that. It took me out of a lot of things, but that was one of them. And I remember him being so angry when I told him that I didn't want to DJ anymore. And he was like, "What are you doing? Like, you put in all this work. You're right at the cusp of being able to quit and have this dream become a reality." And I said, "Yeah, but I'm miserable doing it. And I don't like the person that I have to be in this role, to do this job. And I'd rather go with my peace of mind." And I'm grateful that we're still friends. So it's like I can look back on that moment and go, wow, okay, we made it through that.
What does that feel like in your body? What do you notice that what feelings or sensations are associated with that?
Yeah, there's almost this sense of like I'm surrounded by numbness,
Mm,
almost like an aura that kind of comes out of my body for a few feet.
mm,
And it really is a sense of isolation and being alone. Because I think at that point, I really was. And meditation and the things that I was learning through Buddhism was like this light in the dark. And maybe that's why I was so like I was grasping at it so tightly for a while in the beginning. Like I radically changed my life very, very quickly. And when I look back on it, I go, wow, that wasn't necessarily like the healthiest way of going about finding some sort of spirituality, but it made sense for me at the time. And I think it was because I was so lost. And that was the one sort of beacon of light in the darkness. I mean, I went from getting up, taking bong hits, getting on the train, being at work, taking more bong hits or smoking more pot on my lunch break, on the way home, and then just getting high and drunk pretty much all night, to getting up, meditating on the train, meditating on my lunch break, meditating on the way home, and then going home and just sitting in my room. I gave my bed to my brother because in Be Here Now by Ram Dass, he talked about the power of putting these limitations on yourself and sort of discomfort and how that would help your meditation practice. And so I was like, okay, great. I'm going to do that. Like, cool. It's going to help me meditate more. I'll sleep in a sleeping bag on the floor instead of in my bed. So I was doing anything that I possibly could without a whole lot of direction from anyone, just reading books and trying to digest and take it all in. It made sense for me at the time and it opened a lot of doors eventually. But yeah, at the time that story was happening, yeah, there was a lot of confusion for sure.
Yeah, it sounds like you were desperate for something.
Yeah, I was. And then these sort of transpersonal, unexplainable things started happening to me that were undeniable in my experience, but also very hard to explain to somebody else. And it was just, I started following that intuition and that feeling. And the places that it led me to were pretty amazing.
Jonathan, I'm so curious about you at the beginning of the story. You sound very committed to not being uncomfortable before this moment.
Mhm.
Like you had it down. I smoke here, I smoke here, I smoke
Oh yeah.
here, and all over here. Right. And that really worked for you. And it sounds like you must have needed it at some point.
Hmm.
If you don't mind my asking, like, why did it make sense for you to have that kind of lifestyle? Why did you need to numb out? Why did you need to go to sleep, if you will,
Hmm.
to your life?
Yeah, there were a few really big things that I worked on right after I got sober. Um, and I started to work my steps and focus on my recovery. One was my parents' divorce. They divorced when I was like 4. I'm the oldest of 3. There's a lot of responsibility that I felt for that at the time. There's a lot of patterning that I've worked through as far as trying to save my mom and sort of take care of her. And that I felt like I had to sort of become the man of the house, so to speak, even though I was 4 years old. I also had fairly, in the fairly recent, gone through a pretty bad breakup with like my first girlfriend, and we were living together. We were actually engaged, and she had cheated on me in a very explicit way that was really, really hard to deal with. And so I ended up living with this big DJ and being able to go out and live like a very, on paper, glamorous kind of fun life for 3 years. I went out to clubs and raves usually 5 nights a week, definitely 3, but we would go to multiple clubs. I mean, this guy was getting a lot of work. He was very popular. And so I never paid for anything. I got free drinks. I got free drugs. Like I was in this environment where I could just let loose. And for the majority of that, even though I didn't have a lot of clarity around it at first, I was just so angry. Like I would just try to take out that anger on people almost, like, and when I started to get some awareness of that, I just did not like myself. I remember I was reading this book where there was this metaphor of people wearing masks, and then the mask would become basically how they were presenting in public, and no one could tell that they were wearing this mask. They just took them at their sort of the face value, no pun intended. But I had this moment where I was like, oh my God, this is me. I am putting on this mask and becoming this like really like not a good version of myself to go and to try to schmooze my way into more DJ work and to be out and be more extroverted, which I definitely was not at the time. And then every time I would talk to like a woman, that anger and that rage would like kind of come out sideways. So yeah, like that was not processed at all. And yeah, later on, like in the last few years, I've come to some other realizations about some traumas that had happened pretty early on and how that had affected me through those years. But at that point, I was completely oblivious to it. It was just, cool, let me try to figure out how I'm not the reason that my parents divorced and try to get over this heartbreak that I was living with.
Thanks for sharing all that. What was that like for you when you had to start getting back into your body and feeling all those things that you had been so committed to not feeling and noticing before?
I'm just like sort of taking myself back there. To be really honest, for the first couple of years, it was more of a mental sort of process. At a certain point, and this was maybe, I guess now about 5 years ago, that process broke down when things really started to show up in my body. I call it the thaw, where it's almost like I'm an iceberg thawing, and then the ground that was, trapped underneath starts to come forth. But when that started to happen, I started to have these somatic flashbacks and these experiences that were just completely overwhelming. And the scariest part of it was that the mindfulness that had always been there for me, that I could always rely on to, as bad as this is, I can sit with my breath and sort of wait it out. Eventually, it's going to move, it's going to pass. It stopped working. And once it stopped working, I realized, unfortunately, how much I had been sort of bypassing and gaslighting myself in a way, rather than being with the sensation rather than being able to be truly present to what I was experiencing. So yeah, it was, in a way, it was like I had to relearn things and sort of start over with a different perspective about 5 years ago. But yeah, at the time of the story, it was just, yeah, I thought it was all from the head up, like all from the neck up. And that was the way. And when I look at it now, one of the most famous sutras or sort of scriptures that the Buddha gave is the Heart Sutra. And the core essence of the Heart Sutra, and I forgive me because there's no way that I could explain it fully. It's such a dense sort of teaching. But one of the core tenets of it is this explanation of non-duality, that emptiness is form and form is emptiness, and that both are happening at the same time. They're inseparable. And when I look back at it now, I think I was only focusing on one half of that equation. Like my mind said, oh, if you can just sort of mentally get over this, then it doesn't exist. And when I look at it now, I go, wow, you're really just bypassing a lot of your feeling and a lot of the experience that you had. So I'm grateful that I've kind of moved through that and found new tools and resources for working through that. But yeah.
I'm curious, especially as you start talking about the duality,
Mm.
that aspect of duality, and the paradox that there's often like two things can be true. So when that part of your story where you're talking about the idyllic setting that you were craving, going to the ocean, and also like the strength of your mind, how much of a thinker that you are. I'm curious. There's a part of me that's curious if part of you might have known what that beach was going to look like. If part of your body was even craving that. But I'm wondering, is there another part that knew what that beach was going to look like?
Mm. My sense is that I didn't know exactly, but I also have a sense at that time that I thought it was all grist for the mill. In other words, a lot of my early meditation, I would try to meditate on the subway on the way to work. And so not ideal sort of quote unquote meditation spaces, but I sort of prided myself on this idea that I could overcome it. And when I look back on it, I go, gee, like mostly what I was doing was just developing that sort of mindfulness muscle. In the beginning, there was probably a few months where I just sat and counted my breath because there was no focus or concentration. But I wanted to live up to this ideal, which was no matter where you go, there you are. And that the real sort of power of the practice is being able to integrate that and embody that. And so even if you're in the middle of a busy intersection in downtown LA or on a busy subway train, that you could still hold that mindful awareness. I don't think I did it very well, but that was like the idea. And honestly, what's interesting is there's a lot of stuff in my own practice that's coming up now about those paradoxes, about how do you truly embody these teachings from this very human perspective. You're never going to be able to live up to, right?
Jonathan, I love that part of your story where you talked about as you were drawn into this, you were still wanting to maintain loyalty to that individualistic side where you would have this experiential part of yourself. And I'm more interested in learning about Jonathan's experience and even going back in that day, I'm like curious about. One of the things I'm really curious about, what is it where the place is deserted? What is it that leads you out onto that beach when others would turn around and leave?
Yeah, I think it was stubbornness. Like I was like, no, I'm going to do this. I'm going to conquer this. I'm not going to give up. There was something at that point because of there was this direct experience that introduced me to all of this in the first place, a few months earlier. the word that's coming up is devotion to that. I can stay the course. I can overcome whatever obstacles are happening. And at the time, it felt like very organic, like it was coming out of the practice. It was because I was showing up consistently that just sort of gave me that inspiration of like, no, just keep going. Just keep going. Okay, cool. Like you're noticing that you really want to go home and this is a stupid idea. Okay, that's just a thought. Like, do you have to believe that thought? Do you have to listen to that thought? No, you have a choice. Right. And that was, I just felt like it was part of the sort of the training, so to speak, of like, okay, cool. I'm going to sit here and try to endure in a way, which was, again, that was my thinking at the time. I feel like now it really helps me because one of the first things that I tell to students is like, let's talk about what mindfulness isn't. It doesn't mean that you're going to empty your mind. It doesn't mean that you're going to all of a sudden get calm. It doesn't mean that you're not going to feel discomfort. In fact, in the beginning, you might feel it more because it's really about just being here and being accepting of wherever you are. And if you're frustrated, if you're angry, if you're depressed, then feel it rather than, oh, I have to create this idealized sort of romanticized situation in my mind. And that was that moment that changed for me because I was
And
faced
then
with that.
that moment. So then the other part of your story, Jonathan, that I wanted to understand what you were feeling is when you go back. You
Mm.
go back, it's like Super Bowl Sunday,
Yeah.
and all these other people are in there. What is that moment like when you've just received this deeper insight about and clarity, and yet you go back into this environment? What was that? What was that like? Do you know what that felt like in your body?
It felt like I wanted to leave. Like it was like time to go. I definitely started to isolate more in that household after that. There were a lot of nights like that between that moment and being able to actually move out. There was a lot of partying, sports, drinking, and just sort of general male rowdiness that I had taken part in and all of a sudden had no interest in it. There was this image, and I think I wrote about it in the first draft of the story about like, you can't pull the skin off a snake. And I think oftentimes when we sort of have these desires to change or to create a more purpose-filled life, we're essentially trying to pull the skin off of our own snake a little bit. When you just put the reps in, when you keep doing the work, you get to a point where that skin just slides off naturally without a whole lot of effort. So in that moment, I think there was that friction of like the skin wants to come off, but it's not quite ready yet. And this discomfort of being in that situation, being like, God, I just don't want to be here anymore.
I'm curious about something. I've been thinking as you've been talking about kind of what is your relationship to discomfort? And I've heard you say, I've avoided it. I've tried to numb it, right?
Yeah.
And I've heard you say, I've tried to overcome it and overpower it.
Yeah.
And then I hear this story that seems like such a pivotal moment where it seems like there's this change of like even an intention to go and overcome. And instead it becomes an embodiment where the physicalness of the situation is somehow a mirror to how you're feeling inside, and to be able to really look at yourself and say like, here it is, like I'm going to be real and I'm going to feel this in my body and I'm going to name this, that this sucks. And then I'm just so curious about, every time in this conversation, we've kind of pulled back to that time on the beach. It feels like it's uncomfortable to stay there because soon as you keep talking, I've noticed you kind of go back to like, and this is how I feel really good now.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of like space to give that version of you that is on the beach that there was some drawing to at the beginning. And yet we can't stay with that version of him for very long before we have to move on to my skin's off now. I feel better.
Mm.
I'm just curious what you think about all that.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, we could hang out with it for sure. I think for me, it's like going back, almost 20 years, right? And trying to, so I think that's where I'm at, right? I sort of see the full picture, and I see how this one piece led to other pieces, or was, weaved into other parts of my journey. But yeah,
What does it feel like in your body to offer that invitation?
How do you notice those feelings? What happens in your body when you can put the word lonely or isolated to it?
yeah, I'm tracking like a sort of sensation in my solar plexus. It's almost like a sucking, like into almost like a different dimension, or like behind me, like it's kind of moving from the front to the back.
What is it like for you right now? Like, what is your relationship with that feeling of loneliness?
I feel like I can notice it, and I can, like, I have a lot of compassion for that version of myself. I mean, without all those experiences, I wouldn't be here in this moment, right? And I think that's what I try to sort of hold on to.
How is that linked with compassion? And actually, I don't know if I want to get into the thinking part, but it was
Yeah.
interesting. I loved when I heard, I've got a lot of compassion.
Yeah.
Like I look back at my 20-some-year-old self and I see this, I noticed this. But you went from, I have compassion, and if it weren't for that, I wouldn't have this other part of me. We went out of that part again, quick, to that little guy.
What would compassion and kindness towards that lonely feeling in your solar plexus that wants to pull you back, like, where does that compassion show up in your body? What's that experience like?
There's a sense of like joy, like you're not going to be in that space forever. Like I can kind of reach back and just say like, hey, it's gonna be okay. You have no idea the magic
Is that
that's
like
on your way.
a prickly feeling, a lighter feeling? How do you know you're joyful?
There's almost even like a sense of jumping up and down, like that I can feel. Like it's very childlike, and just sort of, yeah, joy was the word that kind of came up, of like, hey, there's more here. And it's okay to feel like lonely. Like it makes sense, you know?
It makes so much sense why
Yeah.
that younger you was so lonely.
Oh yeah.
I think I notice my response is I just want to sit with that lonely version of you and offer friendship.
Thank you.
Thanks for letting us sit on the beach with you. And that's where we end today. We are so glad you joined us. We want to invite you to get involved in the show. First, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. That way, you don't miss out on a future episode. If you're super curious, you can also find us on YouTube. Second, if you'd like to learn more about joining us and sharing your story, send us an email at phoenixeffectpodcast@gmail.com. That's phoenixeffectpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. This podcast and website represents the opinions of Elizabeth Key, Kristen Boskel-John, and Dennis Roberts, and their guests to the show and website. The content here should not be taken as medical or psychological advice. This content is for informational purposes only, and because each person is so unique, please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. The views and opinions expressed in the podcast and website are our own and do not represent that of our places of work. While we make every effort to ensure that the information we are sharing is accurate, we welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or website. In no way does listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content establish a therapist-client relationship.